Welcome everybody, we are doing a very special, very live Friday Ramblings because I have Friday off, so I do not have to record my stuff in advance like I normally do with the Friday Ramblings. So, I do welcome you to our special live Friday Ramblings. Now it is true that you're not really going to get much change as far as how amateurish and crazy this is going to sound because, as I have always advertised, my Friday Ramblings is done unedited. As I said, the only difference is for these you people who have noticed this happy little stream, you have the ability to chat live with me while I chat away. But in the long term, hey, this is just another fun experiment as I learn the best way to connect to you. Engagement, interaction. Woo-doo-doo-doo. Let's go ahead and get to our subject du jour of the week, because that is what we do here on the Friday Ramblings. We have a subject du jour of the week. And we're going to talk about something that is very important to people of fiction. One of the most important things that fiction gives us when it comes to the power to tell ongoing stories. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, the power of the retcon. That is right. The retcon. Now, for those of you who are not big on creative writing things and literary things, let's go ahead and break down some definitions for you. Alright. And yes, I do have my reference source with me on the other screen, so get over it. That's what I said. You do things live, you do things unedited, you do things unpracticed. You don't always have a memorized script to go off of. Alright. Retcon is a shorthand reference to the concept retroactive continuity, which is a literary device in which established facts in a fictional work are adjusted, ignored, or contradicted by a subsequently published work, which breaks continuity with the former. In short, this is the literary fictional writer's equivalent of time travel. You go to a past story and you say, you know what? We're changing what happened. It can be a super small detail that most people didn't even notice, but it makes you feel better as a writer to have ironed it out. It may be a noticeable change that is being done because when you wrote the original story, you hadn't intended on it to be a long ongoing serial format, and as such, certain things have to be adjusted now because you are more concerned. Excuse me, a little bit of lunch coming up there. As I said, you are more concerned with world building and character history than you were when you published your original story. Now, a lot of people may want to think that the concept of the retcon is a new idea. They may want to think that, oh, going back and changing what you wrote before is kind of crazy, remakey, rebooty thing that people do in the modern age because they just aren't good writers and they just don't apply themselves and they don't have vision like our great, classic, untouchable, perfect writers of yesteryear do. Well, you know what? You're wrong. You are wrong, and I'm going to prove it because I'm going to reference a iconic character of classic literature that has at least one major retcon. This is, in many ways, the first retcon that had a huge impact in that it allowed these stories to continue moving forward chronologically. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, your friend and mine, straight from previous centuries, and I ain't even talking 20th century, I'm talking 19th century, although he did live until the 20th century, Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, aka the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Because you see, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle at one point felt that he was done with Sherlock Holmes, killed Sherlock Holmes in his iconic duel with Professor Moriarty. That short story served as the basis for Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, an excellent film starring the great Robert Downey Jr. But, see, here's the problem. he wasn't done with Sherlock Holmes. Oh, what do we do? What do we do? You got new Sherlock Holmes ideas. The audience wants new Sherlock Holmes idea. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Oh, man. Okay, let's retcon it. Hey, let's retcon the death of Sherlock Holmes, because that is exactly what the story was called. Oh, silly, silly, silly. Well, okay, excuse me. Sometimes it's called The Death of Sherlock Holmes. The original title was The Final Problem. I do correct myself there. It was published in 1893. It was set in 1891. 8 years later, Sir Conan Doyle originally wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles, with the understanding that the story occurred before Sherlock Holmes' demise. This was not unheard of in the Sherlock Holmes stories, as he often wrote stories out of chronological sequence, because he would occasionally come up with an idea for a story that would play better with a younger, less experienced Sherlock Holmes. Not to mention that, as is the nature of retcons, which we'll continue to get into as we talk about the idea of the retcon, he just plain wanted to get more into the past of Sherlock Holmes. So, as it is, in 1903, Conan Doyle wrote The Adventure of the Empty House, which is set in 1894, which would be, yes folks, 3 years after the apparent death of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes reappears, explaining to a stunned Watson he had faked his death to fool his enemies, one of which was the antagonist of The Adventure of the Empty House. Short-term spoilers, former military man who was a expert, badass sniper who was getting ready to snipe Holmes when he returned home. So right there and then we have a retcon from the earliest years of the 20th century, referring to a character that originated in the 19th century. So yes, the retcon is wonderfully old, and there is nothing wrong with the retcon in and of itself. Now, as I've said before, the idea of a retcon is not always to correct past mistakes. The retcon, in its purest sense, can refer to any time you go farther back in the chronology of what you have written before, and therefore can be used simply to add to a story. For instance, if, like our aforementioned friend Sherlock Holmes, as I just mentioned, your stories start out with him already established as a detective, already super smart, already having performed several cases which have given him a reputation in certain circles of society, but you want to kind of help explain what set him on the path to doing this with his life. Guess what? You write retroactive continuity. Your origin story is a retcon. Now, it can be a retcon inspired by passing references you make in stories set in the present. For instance, somebody can just be chatting with their buddy, you're just basically filling dialogue space, and you say, oh yes, you know, I remember when I went to Philadelphia as a teenager, it's a lovely town. 3-4 years later, you write the story where the 14-year-old is in Philadelphia. That is a retcon, and there's nothing wrong with that retcon. It is actually beautifully done. And in that purest sense of the term, any flashback done in any serial format can be considered a retcon once you get past the opening story. Now, as I've said before, retcons are used by authors to increase their creative freedom by allowing them to bounce up and down personal timelines, as well as, originally stated, to help iron out wrinkles because you created something not initially intending it to be a long serial format, but hey, good things happen, it's extremely popular, the fans want more, you got more ideas, you run with it, everybody's happy. Alright, what up, Benny? 1776 or 1776 Benny. Appreciate you checking out my stream. Sometimes, though, you are correcting errors, and that's okay. Sometimes You're retconning things because stories take place over huge stretches of time, because it's a continuity that's worked over by various authors here and there, and you're essentially smoothing out the fact that the character is not aging within the stories, but time itself has aged a few decades, technology's improved, and you kind of want to work some of that new technology into your fiction. Now, one of the easiest places to find retcons is in comic books, because comic books, as I just mentioned, see, gotta love how the brain works, are done over many, many decades because the characters and the concepts are owned by the companies, not the individual writers. Except for some smaller independent labels. That's certainly a discussion for another time. Character-owned or creator-owned versus company-owned. There are pros and cons. That's not our subject for today. But that is definitely a subject worth talking about, people. DC and Marvel being the two biggest companies that are still in business, have been in business for many, 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 many decades, and have continued to use characters going back to their earliest stories, such as Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, Iron Man. They tend to be the easiest places to find retcons. However, retcons are also used in soap operas, movie sequels, cartoons, professional wrestling angles, video games. Going back before the golden age of television, radio serials would sometimes use retcons. Basically, any kind of fiction that moves forward, continues to be published, will eventually, one way or the other, create some sort of retcon. And this is all good, folks. So, as I said previously, we have the addition retcon. This, you do not contradict previously established facts, but instead you fill in missing background details, usually support current plot points. This was one of the earliest sets of stories that the specific phrase retroactive continuity was applied to, because it was seen as a purely additive process, and therefore it was a major positive. One of the greatest examples of this in comic books is Kurt Busiek, who is a wonderful writer, and you should check out a lot of his work, but he did a series called Untold Tales of Spider-Man in, hold on, let me double check my year here so I do not have to correct myself on the fly later. Let's see, 26 issues from September 1995 to October 1997. And the basic idea of Untold Tales of Spider-Man is, much as the phrase Untold Tales says, this was a series in which stories were told that specifically were made to fit between issues of the original long-running Amazing Spider-Man series, helping bridge the gap between those stories, and especially as different writers would come in and out and change things up very quickly and immediately without much worry about the little details of that continuity. Busiek helped smooth out those wrinkles. John Byrne himself, who is another extremely brilliant writer, used a similar structure with X-Men The Hidden Years, and we will probably have a long discussion about X-Men The Hidden Years another day. Some examples in films of additive, make sure I say this right, additive retconning is in the Godfather trilogy. In The Godfather Part 2, the character Frank excuse me, folks, I'm, again, horrible at pronouncing names, as many long-time listeners of Friday Ramsgans know. Frank Pentangeli is introduced as an old friend of the family, though he is not referenced in the first movie. Similarly, Don Altobello is introduced as one of the old-time Dons, even though he is not mentioned until the third movie. Neither edition affects the plotline of the previous films. However, they do technically alter the history of that fictional world. Now, a similar concept is that of secret history, in which the events of a story occur within the bounds of already established events, revealing different interpretations of the events. A wonderful example of this is Alan Moore's additional information about the Swamp Thing's origins, revealing that Swamp Thing was not actually scientist Alec Holland converted into a plant, as had long been assumed for many years by Swamp Thing writers and readers, but was actually a plant that absorbed Alan's body and consciousness, making the plant element believe it was Holland. This did not contradict or change the events depicted in the character's previous appearances, but instead changed the reader's interpretation of them and the character, as it was now no longer a man transformed into a hideous creature trying to form a new life, but a plant transformed into a hideous creature whose perspective on the world and humanity was influenced by the inherited consciousness and memories of Alec Holland. Now, of course, if you want to be really nasty and pick on continuity, following the Brightest Day event, a new Swamp Thing was created that actually was Alec Holland, although this did not contradict the long-standing Alan Moore origin, because, as I said, this was a brand new Swamp Thing. This would be more of a legacy identity character whose origin was a throwback reference to the original assumed origin of Swamp Thing. And of course, in recent years, with everybody's favorite spacefaring franchise, Star Wars, the prequel Star Wars Rogue One addressed a often pop culture mocked plot hole that the Death Star had a glaring, poorly defended weak point in the exhaust port. Anybody who's seen Star Wars A New Hope knows big kablooey after one tiny little energy missile bomb thing. However, Star Wars Rogue One presents the design flaws deliberate due to the head engineer of the Death Star project wanting to sabotage the Death Star, as he was not super evil. Now, the retcons most people think of when they think of as retcons is alterations. The previously mentioned, turns out Sherlock Holmes wasn't dead. He was just faking his death because even though he did kill Moriarty in the final problem, he knew Moriarty had a lot of loyal assistants, lackeys, sidekicks, pawns, who would come looking for Holmes in revenge for Moriarty dying and thus shattering their wonderful little criminal empire. Alright. A similar example was, for all you Marvelites, because we are, do love referencing our comics here, Agent Phil Coulson, who was presumed killed in the Avengers, but was retconned to have survived so he could star in the television series Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Which was great because from the time he showed up in Iron Man 2, Phil Coulson as a character was seen as a fan favorite, so everybody was really happy to see him get his own spin-off TV series and to see him brought back to life. Now, previously mentioned buddy Alan Moore has done alteration retcons. His favorite technique for doing this is false memories. He's used this technique in both the Marvel Man series, Swamp Thing, and his graphic novel, Batman the Killing Joke, although he himself admitted within Batman the Killing Joke that the extended flashback sequence we see that is presented as a origin for Joker is stated by Joker, most likely a false memory, the quote from Joker being, "Hey, if I've got to have a history, I prefer it be multiple choice." This is one of the many reasons why The Killing Joke is considered one of the iconic, if not the iconic Joker story, because it really touches on the madness and psychosis of the Joker. Here's a man who does not want to know for sure who and what he is and why he is. He likes the idea that even to himself, he cannot trust his own memories. Now, one of the greatest bringing back from the dead retcons is the TV series Dallas, which wiped out the entirety of Season 9 in order to bring back the character of Bobby Ewing. And this retcon, because it eliminated, as I said, an entire season of TV episodes of a series that was still quite popular and continued to be popular after the retcon, which in a sense restored everything to how it was before the end of Season 8. This is one of the most mocked retcons in pop culture, especially in modern times when we like to believe we are much more creative in our retconning. We're pretty much not. Blah. Now, we also have subtraction. This is when unpopular or embarrassing stories are sometimes later ignored by publishers and are effectively erased from a series continuity. Later stories often contradict the previous ones or explicitly establish that they never happened. This can be a sake of somebody saying, oh, hey, we're going to go ahead and just say that this, story arc or this 2 or 3 stories done by this one writer was all a hallucination. Sometimes this is actually done when a retcon is introduced, but everybody hates the retcon, and thus they do a second retcon to remove the first retcon. Yes, folks, that's right. I introduced this whole thing by saying this is basically time travel, and like any good convoluted time travel story, you can time travel to undo time travel. It's a wonderful metaphor. I'm going to stick with it probably the rest of my life. Final form of retcon is temporal compression. I mentioned this earlier when discussing... Yep, folks, this is what happens when you record a video shortly after eating lunch. But temporal compression is when film sequels often employ a technique to maintain a sense of currency in each installment, despite more time having elapsed in universe between one installment and another and has elapsed in the reward, or vice versa. For example, despite the implied contemporaneity in each of the films of the Omen series, the lead character ages some 15 or 20 years across 3 films released over a period of less than 6 years. So, this is something that, hey, you also, as I said, can see in comic books when you will write a comic book for 30, 40 years, but the characters themselves don't age. However, because it's always meant to take place in the present time, you see the sudden and occasionally jarring introduction of commonplace technology. When you have a character who is supposed to be somebody that is extremely high-tech, this can definitely create some interesting writing fumbles and needs for temporal compression style retcons, including flashbacks showing that the characters had technology that was cutting edge their entire career, even though in the original origin stories, that technology was something even sci-fi folks hadn't dreamed about. But none of this actually hurts the stories. So, all of this makes retcons sound wonderful, doesn't it? I mean, let's be honest. Hey, we're making long-standing franchises flow smoother. We're making stuff that was not written with the intent to be long-standing, and characters who were not written with a distinct, set in stone, fleshed out origin have one. Why do we have a problem with this? Well, it's very simple, folks. Because sometimes retcons are abused. Sometimes retcons are flat out overused. Now, I am going to pick on comic books with this because, as I said, comic books is one of the easiest to find formats when it comes to retcons due to both the serial nature of comics, that many characters in comics are long standing over decades, so they have a huge history. And the more history you have, the more chance you have of making goofs, especially when you have different writers jumping in the pot and adding to that history. But also because you have, especially with Marvel and DC, a shared universe, which means you don't just have writers taking turns working on one ongoing series like The Amazing Spider-Man, but you also have Spider-Man making guest appearances in things like the X-Men, the Avengers, Fantastic Four. And so you have different writers writing him in their own series, doing stuff that benefits their main recurring regular cast, but it still affects your continuity in your solo series because it's all supposed to take place in the same universe. And sometimes you got to retcon because the wrinkles are created when that happens. So, sometimes you abuse your retcons. You want to jump in on a comic book series. The last writer who worked on this comic for, 3-4 years, he did a lot of status quo shaking up. Okay, I know I'm kind of being sexist by using he as a pronoun. There are many talented female comic book writers. All the respect in the world to them. I'm just using he because the simple fact of the matter is, on a percentage level, there are more male comic book writers across the entire, 100 so odd years of the medium than there are females. And so statistically, more you have a best bet of this occurrence occurring with male writers. This is just a ratio mathematical issue. If I catch myself as the words come out of my mouth, I will try not to keep applying masculine pronouns. But yes, there are many great female writers. So I'm not dismissing them. I'm not trying to ignore them. My brain works on a very mathematical, analytical, scientific level at times. And this is the thing that comes out. Alright. Disclaimer over. I apologize to anybody that was starting to get a little worked up. I apologize if I do not catch myself in the future. I have stated my intent. Let's get back to the subject at hand. As I said, sometimes a writer shakes up the status quo a lot, kills supporting characters off, kills villains off, introduces new villains and makes them, super important to the hero, changes the hero's costume, changes the hero's powers. Next writer comes in because this writer is done. This writer wants to leave. This writer's told all the stories they have in their head for this particular batch of characters, is ready to move on to the next project. But nobody knows where to go from here. It's such a shakeup from everything they knew. So, okay, let's maybe just we'll say this character didn't die. They kind of, pulled the Sherlock Holmes and went into hiding to kind of wait things out. Maybe this character's power change was temporary, even though it was stated at the time to be permanent. Maybe this character decides for whatever reason that they don't like their new costume and they decide to go back to the classic one. Hell, maybe it turns out that the character in the new costume was a whole new villain trying to usurp and establish villain identity. And while they're sitting in prison having been caught, hey, original villain comes back out of hiding in the original costume, explains that this is what happens, and we never see that replacement villain again. Don't laugh, it has happened. I'm not pulling these things out of my butt. So, and it's all well and good. We all move forward. But hey, writer number 3 comes in. Writer number 3. She Hey, see what I did there? I'm catching myself. She says, you know what? I like what Writer 2 did. I like what Writer 1 did. But, Writer A, that first established his character and made them popular, their style and their villains, I want to go back to that. I want to give it a nostalgic retro feel. So I'm going to retcon what that writer did, what Writer 2 did. And they're not going to be retcons that undo the retcons that undid what Writer 1 did. We're just going to flat out let Writer 1's wiped out continuity stand, but we're also going to wipe out Writer 2's continuity so we can go back to Writer A continuity. See, all those ideas are fine in isolation, in a bubble. You need a bubble. But when it's not in a bubble, when it's boom, looked at long term, and it's this writer, this writer, this writer, all retconning what came just before them, that gets abusive. That upsets fans because, hey, I was a really big fan of this person's run. I kind of wanted to see the next person continue this. I like the tone. I like the theme. I like the new characters. And you didn't just shove them into a closet. You shoved them off a cliff. And then when they hit the bottom of the cliff, set them on fire. That's how you drop fans from a series. And I'm picking on comic books when I do this because comic books is a medium that I am super familiar with, especially with things like that. But it does happen in TV. Don't think it doesn't. I cannot cite specific examples right now off the top of my head, but I guarantee you there are some people out there who can cite these examples, have already created lists. Now, before we throw all of this down, before we sit there and lay it all out, finish it up, let's discuss one of the all-time great forms of retconning, and that is when you change actors. This can happen. Sometimes they don't make a fuss about it. Sometimes they do, but it's done tongue-in-cheek. I'm going to go ahead and give a call out, even though I'm not a huge fan of the show, and that's neither positive or negative. I've only seen a small fraction of it. I've never sat there and seriously invested in letting the show try to win me over. But Doctor Who does the best cast changes. Because very early on into the Doctor Who concept, as a television series, they changed actors, and instead of just pretending nothing happened, they looked at the nature of the Doctor as a time-traveling alien and came up with the idea of regeneration. Regeneration is a biological ability exhibited by the Time Lords that allows them to undergo a transformation into a new physical form and somewhat different personality after instances which would normally result in death. Regeneration has been used 12 times throughout the history of the show as a device for introducing a new actor for the lead role of its main character, the Doctor. Other Time Lords and similar characters have also regenerated, usually for narrative rather than casting reasons. So, this, as a retcon, is one of the all-time greats because it almost immediately addressed something that pre-existed in serial films and serial television, and that is the changing of actors, and by creating an in-universe reason that was highly unique at the time, they were able to change the casting of the lead character. This meant that the films were this series was able to continue even if the main actor chose to leave or left for reasons that was not that actor's choice, but the producer studio's choice, whatever. As I said, I'm not super familiar with Doctor Who. I don't know why each individual actor chose to leave, but I just know things can go both ways in the world of business. Not trying to judge anybody, not trying to create any false information about why any given actor ends their time on Doctor Who as the Doctor. Just saying, no matter who chooses to end a particular actor's run as the Doctor, there's a built-in reason that excites fans, that explains changes so that you can not only recast an actor, but go whole hog crazy with it. You can have a older actor and recast into a younger actor without having to claim these are flashback stories. You can change the personality so that the new writers and the new actors are not hampered by having to essentially do an impersonation of the previous actor. Interpretation of the Doctor. And with our current iteration or incarnation, version, regeneration of the Doctor, we even have a change in gender. We have a female Doctor. And that's awesome. You know? Because as somebody who respects the idea of Doctor Who, I have to say that taking the idea of regeneration, going whole hog with it, and swapping out the gender of the Doctor is brilliant. You know, as somebody who's not emotionally invested in any individual Doctor, but is intellectually interested in the creative concept of regeneration, frankly, I think that's the kind of thing that should have been done before now. You know, let's change gender, let's change race. Hell, you really want to go whole hog? Change the species. We're in the age of CGI. Come on. Let's get an avian Doctor. Let's get a reptilian Doctor. It's sci-fi. No limits. So, there is your rundown of the nature of retcons. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope I was able to help you learn a new term, help you recognize something that you may have noticed in your TV shows and went, hey, there is a word for that. Hey, it is more common than I thought. And as we've touched on with our Sherlock Holmes examples, hey, it is something that is a long-standing tradition in literature. But like all literary devices, like all literary tropes, like all literary cliches, like all literary tools, the retcon can be overused and therefore abused. So it is up to the writers involved in any given continuity to be careful when and how they retroactive. I've used the time travel metaphor more than once, and that is our parting thought that when it comes to retroactive continuity, remember the time travel rule. You can do it, but don't overdo it. Otherwise, your timeline gets all wonky. If you don't believe me, ask Dr. Emmett Brown. Alright, folks. We're done for now. Join us next week. Probably won't be live because I don't have next Friday off from my day job, but I appreciate everybody sitting through this with me. Feel free to go watch our archives here on the Roulette Productions channel of YouTube. I have a nice playlist of all Friday Ramblings episodes. I also have a playlist for my Tuesday night game streams. And so you can marathon it, you can pick and choose. Feel free to leave comments. Feel free to suggest future topics. We do try to stick to things pop culture here. And at the end of the day, hey, much love to all my viewers. Much love to everybody who enjoys my topics. And by all means, hey, next time you're watching your favorite TV show, don't forget, spot the retcon.